Linda, and this is Coffee and Crime. This podcast explores real cases involving violence, loss, and the darker side of human nature. Some details may be confronting. Listener discretion is strongly advised.
Oh, the shark has pretty teeth there, and he shows them pearly white, just a jackknife as Mac Heat there, and he keeps it out of sight.
November 1962. For weeks, residents living near a small delicatessen on Burwood Road in Sydney's inner west had been complaining about a smell. At first, it was little more than annoyance, something unpleasant drifting through the neighbourhood. People blamed overflowing bins, rotting food, and dead animals. Anything but the truth. But as the weeks passed, the stench became impossible to ignore. Neighbours began avoiding the footpath outside the building. Shopkeepers complained, customers stayed away. Eventually, authorities were called. When investigators entered the premises, they quickly discovered the source of the smell. Beneath the floorboards lay the decomposing body of a man. The remains were in advanced state of decay, so badly decomposed that identifying the victim became difficult. Police examined the evidence. They looked at the tenancy records, the business documents, the personal belongings inside the shop. Eventually, they reached what seemed like an obvious conclusion. The dead man was the owner, a man named Alan Brennan. The case appeared straightforward. The body was removed, reports were filed, death notices were published. There was only one problem. Alan Brennan wasn't dead, because Alan Brennan never really existed. It was an alias, a false identity used by a serial killer, a man who had already murdered multiple times. A man who would become one of the most feared criminals in Australian history. And while police believed he was lying in a grave, he was still alive, walking free, moving between cities, planning his next kill. This is the story of William MacDonald, the Mutilator. Long before newspapers called him the Mutilator, William MacDonald was simply a boy growing up in Liverpool, England. He was born Allen Ginsberg in 1926. By most accounts, his early life was difficult. He struggled to fit in, struggled to form meaningful relationships, and struggled to find a place where he felt accepted. Those who later studied his life often searched his childhood for answers, for clues, warning signs. But like many serial killers, no single moment explains what he would eventually become. The truth was likely far more complicated. As a young man, Ginsberg enlisted in the British Army during World War II. For many soldiers, war left scars that couldn't be seen. For Ginsberg, those scars appeared to run deep. Years later, he claimed that while sheltering in an air raid, he was sexually assaulted by a superior officer. Whether that event alone shaped the man he would become is impossible to know. But it became central to how he explained his life. He spoke of it repeatedly, to psychiatrists, to police, to anyone trying to understand why he killed. After leaving the military, his mental health deteriorated. He reported hearing voices, and his behaviour became increasingly erratic. Doctors diagnosed schizophrenia. He was admitted to psychiatric hospitals where he underwent electroconvulsive therapy. The treatment was considered normal at the time, but it was harsh, painful, and often frightening. By the time he emerged from psychiatric care, he appeared determined to leave his old life behind. He changed his name. Allen Ginsberg disappeared. William MacDonald took his place. But changing a name couldn't change what was happening inside his mind. MacDonald drifted through countries searching for a fresh start. England, Canada, then Australia. Every move seemed to promise a new beginning, yet the same darkness followed him wherever he went. When he arrived in Australia in 1955, he carried little more than a suitcase and a troubled past. To strangers he appeared quiet, reserved, ordinary. But beneath the surface, violent fantasies were already beginning to take shape. And soon, those fantasies would become deadly. Brisbane, May 1961. The city was warm, busy, ordinary. Walking near Roma Street railway station that evening, realised they were witnessing the beginning of one of Australia's most notorious serial murder cases. Among the crowds was 55-year-old Amos Hugh Hurst. Like countless others, he stopped for drinks. At some point during the evening, he met William MacDonald. The two men began talking, then drinking. Hours passed. They moved between venues. The alcohol flowed freely. Nothing about the encounter appeared unusual. No arguments, no threats, no signs of danger. Just two men sharing drinks. Eventually, Hurst invited MacDonald back to his apartment. The drinking continued. The conversation continued. Then sometime during the night, everything changed. According to MacDonald's later confession, he attacked Hurst inside the flat. The older man was strangled. When it was over, MacDonald covered the body with bedsheets and walked away. The next mistake wasn't made by the killer, it was made by the authorities. Nobody recognised the death as a murder. No homicide investigation was launched. No serial killer inquiry began. No alarm was raised. Officials concluded that Hurst had died from natural causes. The case was effectively closed before it had even begun. MacDonald had committed murder and gotten away with it. The experience taught him something dangerous. He could kill, and perhaps more importantly, he could escape. Within weeks, he would strike again. This time, however, the violence would be impossible to ignore. Sydney, June 1961. 41-year-old Alfred Reginald Greenfield was sitting near St Vincent's Hospital in Darlinghurst. He was vulnerable, alone. Exactly the type of person MacDonald would repeatedly target. MacDonald approached him. The two men spoke. Soon they were drinking together. Alcohol became one of MacDonald's most effective weapons. It lowered suspicion and created trust. It made his victims easier to control. As the evening progressed, MacDonald persuaded Greenfield to accompany him to the Domain baths. There, after consuming more alcohol, Greenfield fell asleep, defenceless, unaware that the man beside him was already imagining his death. MacDonald pulled out a knife, and then he attacked. The assault was savage, relentless. He stabbed Greenfield approximately 39 times. The force of the attack severed major arteries in the victim's neck. Blood flooded the scene. Greenfield never stood a chance. But murder wasn't enough, not for MacDonald. After killing him, he stripped away part of the man's clothes, then carried out the act that would define his crimes. He mutilated the body, removing Greenfield's genitals before placing them in a plastic bag. Later, he travelled to Sydney Harbour and discarded them in the water. When police discovered the body, experienced detectives were shocked. The crime scene was unlike anything they had encountered. The brutality, the overkill, the mutilation. It suggested something deeply disturbing, something ritualistic, something terrifying. The newspapers soon gave the unknown offender a nickname, the Mutilator. And somewhere in Sydney, the man responsible was already thinking about killing again. The discovery of Alfred Greenfield's body sent shockwaves through Sydney. Police were confronted with a murder unlike anything they had seen in recent memory. The violence was extreme. But it was the mutilation that disturbed detectives the most. There was no obvious motive, no robbery, no personal connection, no clear explanation, just extraordinary brutality. As investigators searched for answers, William MacDonald quietly returned to his normal life. He went to work, walked the streets, and blended into the crowds. To those around him, he appeared completely ordinary. But inside, something had changed. The fantasies that had once existed only in his imagination had become reality, and he had discovered something dangerous. He enjoyed it. Not long after Greenfield's murder, MacDonald found another victim. His name was Ernest William Cobbin. Like Greenfield, Cobbin was vulnerable. Like Greenfield, alcohol became part of the encounter. And like Greenfield, he never made it home. MacDonald lured him into a public toilet at Moore Park. The two men drank together. As Cobbin sat unaware of the danger beside him, MacDonald prepared for what he had already decided would happen. Before attacking, he reportedly put on a plastic raincoat. Not to conceal his identity, to protect himself from the blood. And then he launched his assault. The knife struck again and again. Cobbin was trapped, defenceless. By the time the attack ended, he was dead. MacDonald once again mutilated the body before fleeing into the darkness. Now there were two victims, two horrifyingly similar murders. Two crime scenes connected by a signature so disturbing it was impossible to ignore. Detectives knew they were hunting a serial killer, and the public knew it too. Newspapers began comparing the murders to the infamous Jack the Ripper killings. The headlines created panic. Among Sydney's homeless population, fear spread quickly. Men sleeping rough became terrified they could be next. Many abandoned the streets altogether, choosing crowded hostels and shelters over isolated sleeping spots. Police grew desperate. Officers disguised themselves as homeless men and positioned themselves throughout the areas where previous victims had been found. The plan was simple: wait, watch, and hope the killer approached. But the operation failed. The mutilator never appeared. And while police searched the streets, William MacDonald was already planning his next attack. By early 1962, William MacDonald had already killed multiple times. Each murder had followed a familiar pattern: find a vulnerable man, gain his trust, share drinks, lead him somewhere isolated, then unleash violence. The ritual was becoming stronger. The killings were no longer impulsive, they were becoming organised, deliberate, predictable. And with every successful attack, MacDonald grew more confident. He had evaded police repeatedly. No witnesses could identify him, no suspects had emerged, no arrests had been made. As far as he was concerned, he was untouchable. But his confidence was about to create a problem. Because the more he killed, the more attention he attracted. And detectives were beginning to understand the type of man they were hunting. The pattern was unmistakable. The mutilator was still out there. And he was escalating. March 1962, Darlinghurst. 40-year-old Frank Gladstone McLean spent the evening drinking in Sydney's inner city. At some point, William MacDonald noticed him. As always, the approach seemed harmless: a conversation, a drink, a friendly stranger. Nothing that would cause alarm. The two men spent time together before moving towards Burke Lane. It was quieter there, darker, away from crowds, away from witnesses. Exactly where MacDonald wanted to be. As they rounded the corner into the lane, he struck. The first blow targeted McLean's throat, then his face. The attack was sudden and ferocious. McLean collapsed. But before MacDonald could finish what he had started, something unexpected happened. A young family entered the lane. For a brief moment, the killer's plans were interrupted. MacDonald hid himself. At some point, the family saw Frank and realised that he needed help. They hurried off to raise the alarm. Once they were out of sight, MacDonald dragged McLean further into the darkness, then stabbed him repeatedly, again and again and again. By the time the assault ended, McLean was mortally wounded. As he had done before, MacDonald mutilated the body, then he fled. By the time help arrived, Frank McLean was dead. For detectives, it was confirmation of their worst fears. The mutilator had returned, and he was becoming increasingly bold. June 1962. The city was entering winter. William MacDonald had already escaped justice multiple times. Now he was preparing to kill again. On the evening of June 6th, he entered a wine saloon in Pitt Street. There he met Patrick Joseph Hackett. Hackett was a career criminal who had recently been released from prison. The two men began drinking. Hours passed. Eventually, MacDonald invited Hackett back to the accommodation above the delicatessen he had recently purchased under the alias Alan Edward Brennan. Hackett agreed. Inside the building, the drinking continued. As the night wore on, Hackett became heavily intoxicated. Eventually, he fell asleep on the floor. For MacDonald, the opportunity had arrived. He picked up a knife and attacked. The first stab struck Hackett in the neck. But unlike some of MacDonald's earlier victims, Hackett fought back. Awakened by the attack, he desperately struggled for survival. During the confrontation, he managed to force the knife into MacDonald's hand, leaving a deep wound. The injury enraged him. What followed was a frenzy of violence. MacDonald repeatedly stabbed Hackett and then drove the knife directly through his heart. Hackett died where he lay. But even after death, the assault continued. MacDonald hacked at the body with such force that the blade eventually became blunt. And for the first time, he was unable to complete the mutilation that had become his signature. Exhausted, he eventually fell asleep beside the corpse. When morning arrived, he cleaned himself up and sought medical treatment for the wound to his hand. He told doctors that he'd injured himself while working in his shop. The lie was accepted. The stitches were completed, and MacDonald returned to the scene. Back inside the building, he concealed Hackett's body beneath the floor. Then he disappeared. For the moment, nobody knew another murder had occurred. But the mistake investigators were about to make would become one of the most extraordinary in Australian criminal history. After killing Patrick Hackett, William MacDonald vanished. He abandoned Sydney, abandoned his shop, abandoned the identity of Alan Edward Brennan, and disappeared. 17 days passed before Hackett was found. By then, his body had begun to decompose. When investigators entered the premises, they discovered the body hidden beneath the floor. The scene was so difficult to interpret that investigators initially believed they might be dealing with a suicide rather than a homicide. The truth was far more disturbing. Hackett had been murdered, and his killer was still free. Police examined the evidence available to them, the business records, the tenancy documents, the personal effects found within the building. Eventually, they reached what seemed like the logical conclusion. The body belonged to the owner, Alan Edward Brennan. The body was removed and the death recorded. Newspaper notices were published. What nobody realised was that Alan Brennan wasn't really Alan Brennan. Alan Brennan was William MacDonald, and William MacDonald was still alive. Without realising it, investigators had buried a murder victim under the name of the man who killed him. MacDonald remained unaware of the confusion he had created. After leaving Sydney, he travelled north to Brisbane, then across the Tasman Sea to New Zealand. For months he drifted from place to place, using false names, taking casual work, avoiding attention. And because authorities believed he was dead, nobody was looking for him. It was perhaps the greatest piece of luck any serial killer in Australian history had ever received. The man responsible for multiple murders wasn't hiding from police. He didn't need to. Police had already stopped searching. But eventually, the urge that had driven him throughout his life returned. MacDonald came back to Australia. He returned to Sydney. It was a decision that would destroy everything, because Sydney still contained people who knew him, people who remembered his face, and one of those people was about to expose the truth. One day while moving through Sydney, MacDonald encountered a former colleague named John McCarthy. The meeting lasted only minutes, but it changed the course of the investigation. McCarthy stared at him in disbelief. The man standing in front of him was supposed to be dead, officially dead. Yet there he was, alive, breathing, looking straight back at him. For a moment, McCarthy thought he must be mistaken. But he wasn't. It was William MacDonald. Or Alan Brennan, whatever name he happened to be using. The reaction was immediate. MacDonald became nervous, uncomfortable. Then he quickly disappeared. McCarthy knew what he had seen. He contacted police. They dismissed him. After all, the man he claimed to have seen was officially deceased. How could a dead man be walking around Sydney? McCarthy persisted. Again, police showed little interest. Frustrated, he approached a journalist named Joe Morris from the Daily Mirror. The story was too extraordinary to ignore. Soon a newspaper article appeared under the headline, "The Case of the Walking Corpse." The public was fascinated, and suddenly authorities found themselves under enormous pressure. If Brennan was alive, who exactly had they buried? Police had little choice. The grave was reopened, the body was exhumed. Experts began examining the remains once more. This time, investigators looked deeper. Fingerprints were compared, records were re-examined, assumptions were challenged. Then the truth emerged. The body wasn't Alan Brennan. It never had been. The remains belonged to Patrick Hackett, a murder victim, the man police had buried under the killer's name. The revelation stunned investigators. For months, they had believed the case was closed. For months, the killer had remained free. For months, William MacDonald had been living his life. Now everything changed. The investigation exploded back to life. The manhunt began immediately. This time, police knew exactly who they were hunting, and they knew how dangerous he was. As the investigation intensified, police worked to build a picture of William MacDonald's movements. They spoke with former colleagues, friends, and acquaintances, anyone who had known him. Using information gathered from those investigations, detectives produced an identikit image. The sketch was distributed around Australia. Newspapers published it. Police stations displayed it. The face of the mutilator was suddenly everywhere. MacDonald saw the coverage. He knew the net was closing around him. In response, he tried to change his appearance. He dyed his hair, grew a moustache, and he adopted another false identity. This time he called himself David Allen. Then he travelled to Melbourne. There he found employment working on the railways. For a short time it appeared the disguise might work, but he underestimated one thing: the publicity. His face had become too well known. One day, railway workers recognised him from the newspaper photographs, and they contacted police. For months, William MacDonald had managed to stay ahead of the police, but the resemblance was too strong to ignore. Officers quietly began watching him, waiting, confirming his identity. Then, as MacDonald arrived to collect his wages, they moved in. There was no dramatic chase, no desperate shootout, no final attempt to escape. The mutilator was simply surrounded and arrested. One of Australia's most wanted men was finally in custody. News of the arrest spread rapidly. For many Australians, it brought relief. For detectives, it marked the end of an exhausting manhunt. But for the families of the victims, the arrest was only the beginning. Now they would learn exactly what had happened to the men they had lost. And the truth would prove more horrifying than anyone ever imagined. The decades passed, governments changed, wars were fought. Technology transformed the world. Yet William MacDonald remained exactly where he had been left, behind bars. Year after year, decade after decade. He spent much of his imprisonment between Long Bay and Cessnock. Inside the prison system, he became known simply as Old Bill. Surprisingly, age did little to slow him down. Fellow inmates and staff often commented on his physical fitness. He exercised regularly, avoided smoking, stopped eating meat, and maintained a disciplined routine. His favourite activities included watching the news, listening to classical music, and following old murder mystery programs. In many ways, prison became the only life he knew. The outside world continued moving forward without him. Eventually, he became institutionalised. In 2003, after more than 40 years in custody, he openly admitted, "I have no desire to go and live on the outside. I wouldn't last 5 minutes." Parole boards agreed. Application after application was rejected. Authorities consistently concluded that the risk remained too great. The mutilator would never walk free. William MacDonald died on May the 12th, 2015. He was 90 years old. At the time of his death, he had spent more than 52 years in prison. He was one of Australia's longest-serving inmates, the oldest prisoner in New South Wales, and one of the last living links to a case that had terrified an entire generation. Today, William MacDonald is remembered as the mutilator, a serial killer, a predator, a man whose crimes shocked Australia. But the real story doesn't belong to him. It belongs to the men whose lives he stole. Amos Hurst, Alfred Reginald Greenfield, Ernest William Cobbin, Frank Gladstone McLean, and Patrick Joseph Hackett. 5 men who crossed paths with a killer. 5 men who never came home. And at the centre of it all remains one of the strangest chapters in Australian criminal history. A serial killer who escaped because police believed he was dead. A victim buried under a killer's name. And a chance encounter that exposed the truth. Because in the end, William MacDonald wasn't caught by a confession. He wasn't caught by forensic science. And he wasn't caught by a brilliant detective. He was caught because one man recognised somebody who was supposed to be a corpse.
Tell me, babe, please, please tell me, what have I done?
Not every case finds closure. Not every question gets answered. And sometimes the truth stays buried long after the headlines fade. This has been Coffee and Crime AU. For deeper into the case, visit Coffee and Crime AU online. Until next time.